Okay guys, in this video we're going to be going over pinning, cutting, and machine sewing information. I have a little piece of fabric here that we'll be using while we fill out the worksheet. Right here, these two pieces of fabric are sewed together using a straight stitch. Okay, and where they're sewed together, that's called a seam. So number one is seam. Okay, and you can make a seam using a lot of different stitches. On our pajama pants, we're going to be using the straight stitch to sew our two pieces of fabric together, and we'll be using a zigzag stitch to finish the edge. All right, now it's important when we're sewing that we keep this seam an even and equal distance from the edge of the fabric. How we measure that is called a seam allowance. Okay, and our normal seam allowance is 5/8 of 1 inch. These two little dashes stand for 1 inch, or you could just go ahead and write inch. Okay, now here's a picture of a ruler, and I have that because when we're measuring, okay, you're going to be needing to read a ruler. So a lot of times we'll use the seam gauge when I'm grading you. Okay, I'll come through and I will check, is this seam generally about 5/8 of an inch? We'll also use the seam gauge when we're making our casing, which is the waistband of our pants, and when we make the hems, which are the cuffs of our pants. Okay, now your packet does not have a picture of a ruler. Apologies for that. So there are some up front where you can grab them. If you're watching this video after I fix the packet, then you might have a picture of a ruler in there. Okay, but what I'd like you to do is go ahead and find 5/8 of an inch on the seam gauge. So if we look at here, okay, here's our inch. It's divided into eighths, and this longer line is usually the 1/2 inch, and we know a 1/2 inch is 4/8. One more eighth, that's gonna mark the 5/8. Okay. Now the next question is asking about pinning. Okay, it says mark where you'd pin for sewing. I actually want you to do two: cutting and sewing. All right, because these are going to be slightly different. So say we're going to cut out this fabric, all right, and we need to pin it together. What we want to do is put our pins running parallel to the edge. Okay, and I want these pins parallel so that when I go to cut with my scissors, there's not a pin sticking out for me to hit with the blade. Okay, so when we're pinning to cut fabric, your pins, here's the head of the pin and here's the long part, should be running parallel to the edge. Okay, now say this is the edge where we're going to put the seam. We're going to pin to sew it. To pin to sew it, we have to be able to take these pins out kind of as we go. So we want our pins to point to the edge, and that's perpendicular. So when you're pinning, you just put your pin down through all the layers of the fabric, okay, and then up through all the layers of the fabric. And the point of the pin, okay, is going to point towards the edge of the fabric. Okay, so we'll call this pinning perpendicular. So our pins, here's the head of the pin, here's the point. Okay, and that's how we want to sew, because when we are sewing, we have these pins in to hold our fabric, okay, but we don't want to actually sew over the pins with the needle, so we need to take them out. Having them perpendicular to the edge makes them easier to take out as you're going without jamming your machine. All right, so move that out of the way. So number 4, when pinning for cutting, all right, cutting the fabric, the pins should be parallel. All right, and if you want to make a little diagram, all right, 2 lines running next to each other that don't intersect, okay, that means parallel. When pinning for sewing, so we're going to sew this edge, then our pins should be perpendicular. Okay, and if you want to make a little T, that could stand for perpendicular. Put a little parentheses there for you. Okay, now most of our sewing, like in this piece, if I go ahead and take out our pins, most of our sewing is done with the right sides of the fabric together. Okay, so you can see on the inside, this is the right side of the fabric where the printing is nice and bold. Okay, and this is the wrong side of the fabric. So when we pin things together, we pin them to sew with these right sides touching. All right, this way we're making our seam, and the seam is going to be on the inside, on the wrong side of the fabric. And when we flip our pants or our pillow or whatever you're making open, then this edge, the seam is nice and neat, and you're not going to see this part of the extra fabric. Okay, so it's important to sew with the right sides of your fabric together. Sometimes we probably won't do it on our pajama pants, but sometimes we need some temporary stitching just to hold things together and test fit. Okay, this temporary stitching, whether you use your machine or you do it by hand, is called basting. Okay, it's usually a little larger stitch. Where we backstitch, I actually have it on the sample, it's backstitch. A little hard to see, but you can kind of see that this part of the fabric here and here, okay, on the seam, the stitching is a little bit thicker. And that's because at the beginning and the end of my line, I held down the reverse button to go backwards. Backstitching is important because what it does is it secures the stitches. Okay, so where do we backstitch? We backstitch at the beginning, and end of a seam. Okay, and why do we do it? We do it so that it secures or knots the thread. If we didn't have a back stitch, then our line of stitching could come out as we're working. Okay, so with this, you should have your worksheet filled out and labeled. And again, if you skipped this problem because there's not a picture of a ruler, you can go ahead and grab a little extra picture of a ruler from the front of the room.